Today I'm going into my top 10 games of 2018, and while this is not an objective list by any means, I did try to stay as true to my own standards as much as possible without overthinking it. So what I ended up with is simply a list of games that I enjoyed the most. Also, as the title of the video does say, there will be some spoilers mentioned here, so if that bothers you, maybe come back to this video later. Now with that out of the way, here's my top 10 games for 2018. I do feel a little bit odd about putting a collection of games that are over 20 years old and available in about 5 million different collections already in this list, but with all of the additional layers they've added onto them, like online multiplayer, leaderboards, random challenges, and a pretty generous amount of display options, ultimately, the collection does feel like its own package that's totally worth picking up, even if you are like me and you already own most of these games in a few different formats already. I could easily throw some old carts into my Genesis and play these games on my own, but having these new features combined with the ease of switching between them without having to leave my PS4 is pretty cool. This is a very cost-effective and convenient way to experience these games with some modern bells and whistles on top. Plus, there seems to be some space on the bottom shelf here, so I'm thinking maybe some additional games could be added later, like maybe some Splatterhouse, some Chakan, Musha, Devilish. Probably none of those, but I wouldn't be surprised if they did bring some DLC games into the package later on. Again, I do feel a little weird about giving a spot on this list to a game that was originally released many years ago, but I had so much fun revisiting this strange, gorgeous, haunting world that Japan Studio had created for the PS2 that I had to put it on here. As you can tell by looking at it, the game has been significantly modernized for the PS4. This is not just a port, but rather this is one of the most in-depth remasters I've ever seen, executed wonderfully by the master of remasters, Bluepoint Games. The DNA of the original PS2 game is still very obviously present though, as the camera and the controls can still be a little finicky, and that can bring some frustration in tense moments. But make no mistake about it, this is the definitive version of the game. As it always was, Shadow of the Colossus is an experience that is not for everybody. The story and the setting are purposefully vague, and it does essentially just hit the same few notes over and over again from beginning to end. So it really depends on how much this type of thing interests you. If you've ever enjoyed the original version or the port to the PS3, or you've just found it interesting, then you absolutely owe it to yourself to pick up this version and see how well the experience holds up as a very thorough remaster. As of the making of this video, it's only about 20 bucks, which is more than worth it. Onrush is a game that has become pretty special to me. There aren't very many games that feel truly fresh these days, but Onrush is a rare instance where it is taking elements from other games, but it's putting them together to create an experience that really feels like something totally new. For the sake of expediency, I guess you could say this is in the arcade racing genre, but honestly, it's not really a racing game at all, and that nobody is really competing for first place. It really has more in common with a demolition derby game, since the goals are generally centered around destroying as many opponents as you can, or destroying them in a certain way. There's several classes of vehicles to choose from that all have their own strengths and weaknesses and special abilities, and the whole thing is sort of built into a framework that's very similar to Overwatch. Like Overwatch, the game is mostly focused on online multiplayer matches and doesn't really have any kind of story or campaign. But thankfully, unlike Overwatch, there is a fair amount of offline content you can play, although they're pretty much just disjointed training missions. I feel like it's best when played in short bursts, but thankfully it does seem like there is a pretty solid community around this game, especially now that it's free on PS Plus, so hopefully that stays true for a long time, because I can definitely see myself coming back to this game every now and then. I definitely had high hopes for the Spyro Reignited trilogy when it was announced. The Crash Bandicoot Insane trilogy turned out pretty well, and I was hoping that they could deliver at least as good of an experience as that was for the Spyro games, as the original 3 Spyro games were some of the best games on the PS1, and it's even more of a pleasure to play them this way in this collection than I thought it would be. It does have a lot in common with the Crash Bandicoot Insane Trilogy that we got last year, but I would argue the Spyro games ultimately hold up better in 2018 than the Crash games do. The larger, wide open levels and multiple fully voiced characters are things that really helped the Spyro trilogy stand among modern games like A Hat in Time or Yooka-Laylee, which is a testament to how well designed these 20-year-old games really are.
Thanks for releasing me, Spyro!
The soundtrack is excellent, the gameplay feels basically perfect, and it doesn't hurt that one of my favorite voice actors of all time, Tom Kenny, reprises his role as Spyro and several other characters.
Of course not!
If you enjoy this genre at all, I feel the Reignited trilogy really just can't be missed. Some might be surprised to see Spider-Man at number 6 on my list, and if I was doing a list of the 10 most objectively well-made games of 2018, it would probably be much higher, and that's okay because I honestly did have a good time playing through it overall. It's a solid open-world action game, and easily one of the best, if not the best Spider-Man game ever made. I just kinda wish they took Spider-Man in a new, perhaps more creative direction, instead of playing it so safe and making it just feel like an extension of the mainstream Marvel movies. While I don't really see myself coming back to Spider-Man anytime soon, I'm still definitely glad that I played it, and if you're interested in my more detailed thoughts on the game, check out my review that I put up right after it came out. Yakuza 6 might not have the overall wow factor that last year's Yakuza 0 had, but technically speaking, this is the pinnacle of the franchise in a lot of ways. The fights are more seamless and the indoor locations feel more connected to the open world with the elimination of most loading times. The story here is a relatively unique one to the franchise, as an aging Kiryu spends more time introspecting than he has in previous games. And as he watches over the baby of a close friend, lots of undertones about life and meaning and personal evolution do sneak their way into the narrative, and I really enjoyed that. If they were to change much more about Yakuza than they have here, it might not have felt right, so I'm glad that they largely stuck to the formula in this case. My only warning would be that it isn't a good choice if it's your first Yakuza game, but if you already have 1 or 2 games under your belt, I say go for it. I've really enjoyed this new take on the Tomb Raider franchise that we've been seeing from Square Enix, so much so that I was starting to think they were giving the Uncharted series a run for its money, especially with the second game, Rise of the Tomb Raider. There is a deepness to the new Tomb Raider games, with upgradable weapons and exploration and skill trees that Uncharted games just refuse to have, so I was really excited to see how much further the third game could push the envelope, but unfortunately the answer to that is not really at all. Which isn't to say Shadow isn't a great game, it really is, but mostly because it treads the same ground that the last game did. So while this game does kind of feel like a plateau for the series in some ways, it's still a quality action-adventure game, and I thoroughly enjoyed my time with it. The story is fairly boilerplate for the series in most ways, with some memorable moments sprinkled in. Plus, the exploration is just as satisfying as it ever was in the previous games, which is one of my favorite aspects of these new Tomb Raider games. I tend to go through the story and save the exploration for after it's done, and doing that in this game turned out really well. It's definitely worth a play if you enjoyed the previous games, just don't expect a lot of huge innovations or overhauls to what you experienced in Rise. Remothered Tormented Fathers was one of the great surprises of the year for me. I feel like it was made specifically for me in some ways. It blends old school survival horror with modern controls and accessibilities, and because of that, I just had a great time playing it and unraveling the completely insane story that they've put together here. It's got its problems, but if you're willing to overlook the less than perfect controls and some minor audio issues, there's a lot of fun to be had here, especially for those of us that grew up enjoying survival horror games from the late 90s and early 2000s. Apparently, Remothered is intended to be a trilogy too, so hopefully we see more of it in 2019. This was kind of a tough choice for me because I love this game so much, and I feel like a compelling case could be made for Detroit Become Human to be many gamers' Game of the Year. And even though it just barely fell short of that for me, I still can't help but to shower Quantic Dream with praise. In my opinion, this is their best work by a mile, which is saying a lot, as Heavy Rain is still one of my favorite games of all time. Detroit, however, kept me glued to my TV more than most things have in a couple of years now. There are so many moments in this game that are firmly etched in my memory, like the opening stage with Connor navigating the hostage negotiation with a deviant android, Lance Henriksen's character's altercation with his deadbeat son in the art studio, which triggers Marcus's malfunction, or evolution, depending on how you see it, and making Connor choose between saving another android, thusly exposing his own deviancy, or killing her, which he and you, as a player, inherently just don't want to do. Also, the scene where Kara finds out that the girl she kidnapped from the abusive father and had been protecting all this time is also herself an android, meaning that she and this girl are just two androids looking for a human relationship from each other, further blurring the philosophical line between what really separates man from machine. This game ultimately left me thinking about that particular point. Are we really that different from machines just because we have emotions and consciousness? What even are emotions and consciousness if not just chemical reactions to real-time outside stimuli? Isn't that essentially what a computer is anyway? So it's a lot of food for thought, and a very interesting intellectual exercise regardless of where you land on it.
You knew from the beginning. You just didn't want to see it. She wanted a mom, and you wanted someone to care for. You needed each other. What difference does it make? Do you love her any less now that you know she's one of us?
If you can appreciate story-driven adventure games like this, then you absolutely have to play Detroit Become Human. It's a true masterpiece and would have easily been my game of the year if it weren't for just one other game. I suspect this will be at the top of a lot of people's lists, and if you know anything about my gaming tastes at this point, you probably saw it coming a mile away for me. God of War is not a perfect game, no game is, but it absolutely brings a timeless classic to your PS4. All of the narrative themes about accepting change and being at peace with your past are so expertly and delicately woven into this game on so many levels. I'm still shocked with how much they could change this franchise without clashing with the mentality of the older games. The two philosophies intermingle in distinct provocative ways that are sometimes subtle and sometimes more bombastic and noticeable, like when Atreus sees a haunting vision of a younger, more ferocious version of his father murdering Zeus ages ago, as if to serve as a metaphor for what a younger gamer today might feel after playing God of War 2018 and experiencing the series for the first time, then learning of the franchise's more obscene previous installments, and trying to make sense of it all. And of course, my favorite section when Kratos goes back to get the Blades of Chaos to save his son, confronting Athena along the way, then using the symbol of his past shame to savagely tear apart those that stand in the way of his future with his son. This is, of course, a perfect analogy for anyone who has ever had to decide to stop running from a painful chapter in their past and instead confront it to make peace with who they have become as a result. These are just a couple of the most apparent moments when the themes of personal growth make themselves known, but rest assured the game is littered with more of them. God of War 2018 is an intense, unwavering evolution of a series that, frankly, I didn't think needed one, but now I can't imagine the series without it. It single-handedly saved a franchise that had nowhere to go after killing off its main antagonist, exponentially raised the value of the system it requires to play, and provided a classic, timeless action game that combines fantastic modern gameplay with an emotional yet astute narrative on what it really means to grow. So, there's my list for my favorite games of 2018. Feel free to leave me some suggestions of great games in the comments. I try my best not to miss any great games, so suggestions are always welcome. Until then, thanks for watching.